So in this video, I'm going to sort of cover the main focus of the article that was posted online on Fixers and the role that they sort of play when it comes to Western journalism and coverage in particular of the Iraq War that started in 2003. For starters, we learned in class last week what Fixers are. I have never heard of it before. Even being someone who has worked in journalism and in this industry, I never heard of a fixer, which I think has sort of an overlying meaning of the exposure that they get when it comes to actual publishing of newsworthy things. It seems like they don't really get the praise that they deserve. They define the role of fixers, or they even called them translators at times, because they were sort of the medium between events that go on in foreign places and the arrangements and interviews that they sort of have to conduct and sort of manipulate because of the language barrier. The article said that sort of the role of fixers can be better understood when people understand the changes in Western media ranges for foreign news gathering, in particular with something such as the Iraq War. When it comes to the first concern for journalists covering the Iraq War or some sort of foreign event that does pose a threat, it's safety, of course. Between March of 2003 and I think it was the middle of 2006, 80 journalists were killed, along with 28 co-workers that were either interpreters or fixers. They were killed in Iraq specifically. That's obviously a main concern, and that's why having military personnel is key. But they weren't always able to have that, and as discussed in the article. The second concern is the key reason why fixers are so crucial, and it's the reliability of translators and interpreters. Fixers are the interpreters in a circumstance where relatively no journalists, Western journalists, speak a language or are localized in an area. As we said in class, fixers are journalists' eyes and ears. And that was emphasized in this article, and they're really the essential point of contact where ordinary Iraqis can have a generic conversation almost with the journalist, but the fixers are that person in between. The article said for journalists who said they did not depend very much on fixers, they had to turn to a minority of Iraqis that did speak English and that probably weren't as localized or as informed on a certain situation, but that's how they had to depend. That's what they had to depend on because they didn't have fixers or because they didn't want fixers. The significant differences in which journalists and fixers differ was something that was intriguing to me, and the first one was that journalists can disagree on the extent to which these fixers impacted the way they covered a certain event. I feel like this is inevitable, but I feel like it can be totally problematic on both ends. I think a fixer can feel a certain way about how a journalist covered, a newsworthy story in which they conducted the interview, or it can go vice versa to where journalists can feel that a fixer didn't properly convey the rhetoric of the interview that they sort of acted as a medium. This comes down to the whole mistranslation, misinforming, and like I said, it goes both ways. And even having a journalist that says that that they can speak a foreign language, they're not necessarily. It's that localized element. They're not necessarily localized in a certain area. They don't know the professional competence in a different language, which is key for putting out a story that's published by big time news companies and so forth. A couple other things. In a few cases, journalists referred to the danger of fixers understanding too well what their journalists wanted. What this basically means is that these fixers are almost knowing what their journalists want in a subjective manner, and because of that, they're conducting interviews or translating information in a subjective manner, which produces subjective news, and that's obviously not something that someone would typically want. The whole point of covering news is to be as objective as possible. So I think this is obviously another, significant problem that could arise from, the whole role of fixers and correspondents and how they work together. Another thing that interests me in this article was just talking about correspondents and journalists overseas in general and the whole role of a parachute journalist. It's basically someone who's like a crisis journalist who goes into a certain location when something happens and then they leave. They're not localized in the area by any means. or they leave one place and they go to another location, another country where something's going on. It's like they're literally going from place to place, traveling, parachuting from place to place, not truly being a correspondent. It's more just a parachute journalist. I like this term, and I think it is very relevant nowadays, and obviously was probably relevant during the Iraq and Iran wars. This also influenced the great rise in fixers and how crucial they were, because typically correspondents, let's say, are posted in an area for years, and they do become cultured in a way to how these areas go about things, and they do get better at the languages. But with parachute journalism, that's not really the case, and that just increases the necessity for fixers. As a whole, like I said, I never knew what fixers were. I'm glad that this article mentioned the fact that they aren't highly coveted, and that this article was sort of combating that lack of information, to where these people actually do play a great role in Western journalism, and the changes in which Western journalism has evolved around covering, foreign news, and how correspondents can be successful overseas. I think fixers need to have much more exposure, and I think fixers do play a great role in journalism, particularly, around the world, globally.